Our second reading is from the Gospel of John. Some time later, Jesus crossed over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee, that is, Lake Tiberias, and a huge crowd followed him, impressed by the signs he gave by healing sick people. Jesus climbed the hillside and sat down there with the disciples. It was shortly before the Jewish feast of Passover. Looking up, Jesus saw the crowd approaching and said to Philip, "Where can we buy some bread for these people to eat?" Jesus knew very well what he was going to do, but asked this to test Philip's response. Philip answered, "Not even with 200 days' wages could we buy loaves enough to give each a mouthful." One of the disciples, Simon Peter's brother Andrew, said, "There's a small boy here with 5 barley loaves and 2 dried fish. But what good is that for so many people?" Jesus said to them, "Make the people sit down." There was plenty of grass there, and as many as 5,000 families sat down. Then Jesus took the loaves, gave thanks, and gave them out to all who were sitting there. He did the same with the fish, giving out as much as they could eat. And when the people had eaten their fill, Jesus said to the disciples, "Gather up the leftover pieces so that nothing gets wasted." So they picked them up and filled 12 baskets with the scraps left over from the 5 barley loaves. The people, seeing the sign that Jesus had performed, said, "Surely this is the prophet who has come to this world." Seeing that they were about to come and carry him off to crown him as a ruler, Jesus escaped into the hills alone. As evening approached, the disciples went down to the lake. They got into their boats, intending to cross to Capernaum, which was on the other side of the lake. By this time it was dark, and Jesus had still not joined them. Moreover, a stiff wind was blowing, and the sea was becoming rough. When they had rowed 3 or 4 miles, they caught sight of Jesus approaching the boat, walking on the water. They were frightened, but he told them, "It's me. Don't be afraid." They were about to take him into the boat, but suddenly the boat was ashore at their destination. Hear what the Spirit is saying to the church. Let's pray. Let the words of my mouth, let the meditation of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. As some of you may already know, I am allergic to cooking. It's not that I don't know how to cook. It just hurts physically to even think about what to cook and to plan ahead to get the right stuff in the house at the right time, and then figuring out how to prepare it all after all of that preparation. Leftovers play an important part of my life. I try to cook one big meal as few times as possible and then feast on leftovers for as long as they last. In fact, my breakfast this morning comprised of some leftovers. Leftovers aren't always so convenient though. I've worked out a system where, I can do leftovers several days in a row without a problem. And to add a little variety so it doesn't feel like I'm eating the same food, I might sprinkle some cheese over at one time and add some sauce another time. But if I make it that far into my leftovers, if I have not already run out of them, I usually stop eating it around then, and then I'll move on to the next set of leftovers. Now I'm not going to get into details about how the new leftovers push those old leftovers to the back of the fridge, with each new cycle of leftovers getting pushed further and further back and forgotten. I'll also skip over telling you how when my fridge gets full and it's time to replenish it with fresh food, I have to brace myself and venture into the scariness in the back of the fridge of these long forgotten leftovers. I don't even bother looking in the container. If it's in the back, it's got a one-way ticket to the trash. No questions asked. Before leaving for a few days this week, I tried to eliminate some containers of leftovers so I wouldn't have to deal with any unpleasant surprises when I get back. While my mom was away this weekend, she'd asked me to take care of the little garden that she started in the backyard, which was a direct result of all my adventures in St. Louis of gardening. I remember one time in particular, I was anticipating her call that would end in a detailed report about what was going on in my garden. So I went to the backyard and I dug up a couple sweet potatoes that probably could use a little more time in the ground. The peppers were hanging on tightly, but weren't quite ready to pick. And I remember a few days before, the tomatoes, which were still pretty green, I had seen one reddish tomato kind of in the middle of it. And when I looked there the last time I was there was a tiny little bite that a critter had taken out of it. And so I went back this day to find it through the greenish stuff, and this time when I found it, instead of a tiny little bite, I saw a red, shriveled up leftover, what used to be a ripening tomato with a bite mark in it. It was actually kind of gross, so I picked up a stick and I flipped it off. In cleaning out my fridge and tending to my mom's little garden, and remembering my own efforts in harvesting my veggies, my mind moved to this gospel text that we heard this morning. I know many of us have heard the story a million times, and again, even last week, we briefly read over that story. Remember that Jesus had been healing and teaching for quite some time, and they'd seen him do his miraculous works. And as Jesus was trying to take some time away from himself, here these crowds gathered on the shore as he was returning from his brief retreat on the boat. People recognized that he'd been gone away, and they followed him to his space away. And so by the time he gets back on shore, he's met with crowds of people. Jesus shows them compassion, and he continues his healing work upon those who have gathered. Evening comes along, and his disciples begin to show concern for Jesus, who was trying to catch a break in the first place, but somehow ended up working overtime, healing all these people. They tell him it's getting late and their location is somewhat deserted, and they tell Jesus it's probably best to send folk home to figure out food for themselves. It makes sense that the disciples were concerned about the logistics of dinner time, offering to put into effect the every person for him, her, themselves mentality, to get these thousands of people fed. But instead of following their logic, Jesus said to them that there's no need to turn these people away. The disciples can feed them. Baffled, they very practically answer how they only have 5 loaves and 2 fish, barely enough for a few people to eat. And Jesus tells them to bring it to them anyway. And then Jesus tells the crowds to sit down. And the crowds sit all throughout the rest. And Jesus takes these loaves and he breaks them. He takes these fish, he blesses them, and then he tells the disciples to distribute these into the crowds. Miraculously, there was enough for everyone to eat and to be full. Now Jesus could have ended it right there, and we'd still be marveling at the greatness of this act. But nope, the story continues. After everyone ate, after everyone was filled, they were instructed to take up all the broken pieces left over, and they filled 12 baskets full. Keeping in mind my recent encounters with leftovers in the fridge and in the garden, but the tenderness with which Jesus addressed these remnants seeps right in and touches me at my core. All those broken pieces were gathered enough to make 12 whole baskets of leftovers. I know just thinking about what those leftovers even looked like makes this gesture even more meaningful to me. Our society, myself included, can be so flip about our leftovers. I know I'm not the only one who every couple of weeks or months, if I'm honest, goes to the back of the fridge to find long forgotten leftovers from who even knows when. We throw away so much that it's actually almost obscene if we were to sit and think about how many people around the globe who don't even know where their next meal is coming, or even if it's going to be coming. We don't even have to go far from our own communities. And not only does our flip attitude apply to our physical food, but it applies to our spiritual food as well. When we're hungry spiritually, we find our way to the shore in whatever ways is necessary to get to our next spiritual meal. When we're in obvious need, we search out ways for God to help us, to swoop in and see us through in this deepest time of our needs. But when we get that satisfaction, we tend to tune back out at least a couple of notches. We get intoxicated with that fed feeling, content over our latest situations that God has helped us resolve. And then we miss all those tiny leftovers around us that continue to see us through each day. We get so caught up in our fast-paced world, following the crowds, waiting to see the next miracle that God has for us, that we neglect to see the little miracles and opportunities fulfilling and being filled that exist all around us all the time. We go about life treating each other and sometimes even ourselves like the yucky leftovers in the back of the fridge. When we encounter those who differ in vast or small ways, we don't even bother to get to know them enough to recognize our similarities or even to get to celebrating our differences. Instead, we flip them off to the side from a distance and leave them there to waste away. Even though we're called to participate in the feeding of the masses, our logic defaults to the desire to protect and care for us and ours. Gratefully, God does not operate using our logic. Jesus shows us just how God's compassion is boundless. Our God is a God of abundance, where everyone has their fill and has more than enough for leftovers. So now I'm left wondering, how would it be if we were to truly do as Jesus instructed the disciples back then and took food in its many forms out to all the people? How might it be if we were to gather in those remaining fragments, no matter how they looked, and start noticing God at work all around us? How would our lives look if we were to move beyond our own satisfaction and compassionately care for the oppressed or the supposed scraps left over? I can just imagine what it would feel like to be filled with the fullness of God. It's amazing enough to be filled with the fullness of the cooking someone else does. But to be filled with the fullness of God and have some left over, that is something we can all strive for in our lives. And as we prepare to share in the broken bread again next week, I'm challenging us to open ourselves up to the abundance with which God deals in our lives. And I know it seems extremely silly to say this to this particular congregation, because y'all are actively engaged in some of the most meaningful and urgently relevant ministries every single week. But to repeat my sentiment from last week, for those of us who remain attached to the work of Christ all around us, perhaps getting to experience this delicious abundance is in taking even just a few moments to ourselves in the boat before we're called to re-encounter the crowds on the shore. So whatever it means for you this week, I hope that we'll all be mindful and intentional about God's abundant leftovers as we gear up to share communion next week. Let us go back into the world with all of our senses open and ready to experience God's more than enoughness. I pray that we're able to not only recognize the spiritual leftovers in our lives in ways that will allow us not to discard them because we're full, but to gather those up carefully as Jesus instructed those on the shore. And then for us to share them with all of those who hunger after the fullness of God. I pray that we learn to do this more regularly, not just for others, but also for ourselves. My prayer is that we can all be filled with the fullness of God, now and always. Amen.